everyone. Thank you for coming today to hear the lecture of our guest speaker, Mrs. Jean-Marie Simon, entitled Guatemala's War, Historical Memory, and Historical Accuracy. I want to take the opportunity to give our appreciation and thanks to the class of 1993 who made this event possible. My name is Ana Yolanda Contreras, and I am a member of the Faculty of the Languages and Cultures Department, and also a member of the Forum of Latin American Studies. It is my great honor and pleasure to present to you Mrs. Jean-Marie Simon. She is a person whose work I have followed for a long time, but I didn't have the chance to meet her before today. Please allow me to give you a summary of her achievements and some background of her work. Jean-Marie Simon received her undergraduate degree from Georgetown University in 1991, and in 1991 she received her JD degree from Harvard Law School. After her time in Harvard, she obtained her bar's license and practiced law for 10 years. Presently, she teaches Spanish at St. Albans School in Washington, D.C. She was a recipient of a Fulbright scholarship to do academic research in Ecuador and was awarded the Bunting Fellowship from Radcliffe Harvard University. Jean-Marie Simon lived and worked in Guatemala as a photojournalist between 1980 and 1998, a period of extreme violence and brutality in this country. Some of the photographs that you might see today in her presentation are from that period of time, and were published in the book Guatemala, Eternal Spring, Eternal Tyranny, now in preparation for an iTunes ebook edition. This English version was translated to Spanish, and the first edition was published in 2010. Her book's Spanish language version has had 3 editions. Her intention in publishing the Spanish edition was to donate 1,000 copies of the first edition to schools and universities in Guatemala, so that these institutions will have a document that tells the truth of what happened during the civil conflict. Furthermore, these pictures will raise awareness among the younger generations who didn't experience the civil conflict, and will keep the memory of that period of time alive among those who experienced those terrible years. Jean-Marie Simon's photographs have appeared in Time, the New York Times, the New Republic, Harper's, Geo, Vogue, and Newsweek, just to mention the English-speaking publications. She has had solo exhibits at the O.K. Harris Gallery in New York, the Photographers Gallery in London, Quarto in Tokyo, and last month she had an exhibition in Bilbao, Spain, titled Mayan Women, War, and Justice. Her photographs have been widely reviewed in many academic publications and have also been used in film documentaries, especially in The Echo of the Pain of Many, El Eco del Dolor de Mucha Gente, directed by Ana Lucia Cuevas. And now, please join me in welcoming Jean-Marie Simon.
Thank you, Ana. Gracias. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Maybe I should, let's try it without the mic on. First, thank you so much for having me today. I'd particularly like to thank the Center for Regional Studies for inviting me. It's truly a pleasure to be here, particularly the director, Mark Rees, Keith Himmer, and especially Professor Contreras, who contacted me last fall. It really is an honor to be here. In fact, I was so pleased by this that when Professor Contreras contacted me last fall, I immediately posted on my Facebook page, wow, I'm going to go to the U.S. Naval Academy and speak to the cadets. And I immediately, I know, yeah. And I immediately received a plethora of polite and not so polite replies saying, no, Jean Marie, they're midshipmen, middies, or mids. Did I get that right? Okay, so my apologies. But I stand duly corrected. And again, it's really a pleasure to be here. Can you still hear me? Yeah? Can you hear me in the back? Oh, okay, so the subject of my talk today is Guatemala, and Guatemala in the 1980s, when I worked there from 1980 to 1988, as Professor Contreras said. And I was thinking, you know, I was reading the newspaper yesterday, and I was thinking, most of you, none of you were born then, except for some of us professors. And so why would you ever want to listen to a talk on Guatemala, except that maybe you'll flunk Professor Contreras' course if you didn't show up to eat your pizza here today? And so I was reading the newspaper and I thought, well, these poor midshipmen, they barely have time to read a newspaper or look at their Twitter account. They're being avalanched with tweets on this and that. The front page of the New York Times yesterday, there might be a vaccine for Ebola. The Boston Marathon terrorist was convicted. Artificial island found in the South China Sea. Why would Guatemala ever be important to us? And I guess I have a few reasons. First, historically, history is important to us, and Guatemala is part of history. Guatemala, some of you, have any of you ever heard of the dirty wars in Latin America? These dirty wars are sort of a generic name for the series of events that took place in 8 or 9 Latin American countries, beginning in the 1960s and continued throughout the 1980s. And it's sort of not really a euphemism, but a name for what usually meant a military takeover where a civilian government is ousted. And then these military regimes were intent on wiping out communism or the appearance of communism, or more generically, opposition. And in these countries, what happened was very often, not only was the opposition wiped out or forced into hiding, but many other people were caught in a very wide net that this scourge was. And so you had people, all kinds of people, who were being forcibly abducted or disappeared. Disappeared became a transitive verb in Guatemala in the 1960s. It meant that people were forcibly abducted and either spirited from their homes in the middle of the night by the army, the police, or their confederates, by judiciales, plainclothes police. They were disappeared. There were killings. There were many massacres. And Guatemala is sort of a microcosm of that. And it's a real dichotomy, because on the one hand, Guatemala is this really small place. I actually found this. I don't know what Virginia and Guatemala have in common except their size, but there it was. Guatemala is about the same size as Virginia. And Guatemala in 1982 had a population that was about the same size as New York City. So you think of this dirty war in which tens of thousands of people are killed, including old men, young children, pregnant women, in a country the size of Virginia with a population of New York City in 1982. And that's really quite an enormous statistic to consider. The second reason I thought that Guatemala, I mean, I'm very personally invested in Guatemala, so I'm not objective about this. But the second reason I find Guatemala important is because of U.S. involvement. I'm sure that you, as midshipmen, have studied military history, and perhaps tangentially to that, you've studied U.S. intervention in Central America, in Latin America. And in Guatemala in particular, we sort of see 1954 as a benchmark date for intervention, because United Fruit Company was very involved in Guatemala. They had huge exports of bananas and other products.
Was it too low, I guess, was the problem?
Is this better? Is it better if I talk? This one? Okay. Me? Okay. Oh, I should mute it. And so, yeah, thank you. And so, so Guatemala during this time, I actually like shouting. I do it at my students all the time. Guatemala during this time the U.S. determined that the Reds were taking over Guatemala. Communism was infiltrating Guatemala. And indeed, Guatemala's president, Jacobo Arbenz, who ironically was an army colonel, was a socialist. He was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party, in fact. He had instituted a series of social reforms in Guatemala, including a very modest land reform. This, of course, infuriated the United Fruit Company. And so in concert with the Secretary of State, John Dulles, and his brother Alan Dulles, who was head of the CIA at that time, and one of them sat on United Fruit's board, they orchestrated a very successful military coup. First, they ferried journalists from Time magazine and the New York Times down to Guatemala. They came back and duly reported that communism was infiltrating Guatemala. And in 1954, President Arbenz was ousted, and Colonel Castillo Armas was flown in from a U.S. base in Florida to take over Guatemala's government. And so this is just a little icon I found on Wikipedia or something. And this perception of Guatemala and the Isthmus being potentially communist, of course, marched right through the 1970s and 80s, through the Cold War. And Guatemala, the height of violence in Guatemala really in the 1980s also coincided with the Cold War, and then this diminution of the Cold War. And here's Ronald Reagan, Stop Communism, Central America. The third reason I think we should care about Guatemala, and I don't mean to sound like a bleeding heart with this, but I think we as Americans, we care about the world. We care about places that are unlike our own. And we want those places to have things that we take for granted, like running water, potable water, drinking water, literacy, to be able to go to school, to have, you say what you want about the IRS, but we sort of have a tax system that works. 12% of Guatemala's population actually pays taxes. You can imagine the spill-off effect in a country that has no tax base. And so we look at Guatemala and we think we want something better for this country without imposing ourselves on it. And my fourth reason for being interested in Guatemala now currently is really a function of my having lived in Guatemala. I lived in Guatemala from 1980 to 88. I was a photographer and the researcher for Human Rights Watch in New York. I did work for Amnesty International. So I knew Guatemala up close and personal. And then I've been back about 35, 40 times since 2008 to do the Spanish editions of my book, and now the iTunes, the Kindle version. And so I have a pretty good sense of what's been going on in Guatemala, except for this huge hiatus with law school and getting married and having a kid, which took up 20 years, in fact. But I read stuff that's coming out on Guatemala now, and I see documentaries coming out on Guatemala now, and they are very removed from what I experienced as a journalist. I think part of this is just sloppy journalism, sloppy scholarly work that relies too much on secondary and tertiary sources. I also think some people just have a deep emotional involvement in Guatemala. They love Mayan culture, or they remember when they were hippies backpacking through Guatemala. And they have a certain perception of Guatemala that doesn't hold anymore. And then there are the people who are very self-involved, and they want to go out and get grants for their films, or they want to go and get their tenure. And they know the buzzwords. They know that genocide gets people's attention. They know that some other things get people's attention. And so I see this real, sometimes manipulation, sometimes and often revisionism of those facts. And so I think we need to be generically not just interested in Guatemala, but also to always be on our toes about places generally. Is historical memory accurate? Is the data good? If the data is not good on how many people were disappeared, how many people fled Guatemala, then it's just garbage in, garbage out. So I'm going to show you some photos of Guatemala. And This is sort of what I'll get to this later. I should have shown it earlier, but this current crop of documentaries and books, scholarly works on Guatemala, many are fantastic. There are people who've written great books. Bob Brenneman, for example, wrote, what was it called, Homies and Hermanos, about gangs in Guatemala, highly recommended. Other books out there too. This is a film, I will get to it at the end, where that has completely misdepicted this scene of a massacre. Guatemala is just this beautiful country, and still is, despite various conquests, whether it's the Spaniards or tourists or the United States. Tourists probably the worst. And you can see it's very different. But what's incredible about Guatemala is it's only 2 hours from Houston. It takes me longer to fly from, from Reagan National to Houston than it does to get from Houston to Guatemala, which is significant. And people still maintain their traditions. Half of Guatemala is still Mayan Indian. And you can see this goes on every single year in Guatemala. This is a feast day in an Ixil town, which was actually the center of the 2013 trial against a former dictator. The basis of that criminal trial was that this population had basically been wiped out, which it had not. You see, these traditions are just really, it's a very beautiful place. These people were totally drunk, so like all dancing. It's like, I could have said these were nice elderly people dancing, but no, they were quite drunk. U.S. involvement in Guatemala is really pervasive. It's all over the place. But you can see how poor, forgive my terrible Patagonia shoes, I thought I could stand behind the lectern, but that's not going to really work. This little boy was sick. But his parents had no money even for the bus. The bus cost 5 cents. And so his dad was carrying him to the local clinic. And the other guy, of course, was carrying firewood. This baby was 9. I should get the little pointer out of the way. This baby was 9 months old, actually, when the picture was taken, and he died the next day. Guatemala, as I was saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Guatemala, accounting for inflation, people actually earn probably about as much now or less as they did in 1980-81. And one of the major sources of death in Guatemala now, well, there are 3. One is common crime, the other is narco, cocaine, drug-related violence, and the third is still malnutrition. When kids are weaned, the moms give them powdered milk made with water. The water is not potable water, and they get extreme dysentery and die. This is a garbage dump. This is, it's sort of a dumb photo, but people scavenge for recyclable materials in the garbage dump and they sell them. And this person who works in the garbage dump, she searched for dolls and she washed them and hung them out to dry, and then she resold them at Christmas to poor people who couldn't afford a doll from a store. That's a vulture in the dump. 16-year-old coffee pickers. It's a man hauling sugarcane in this incredibly hot warehouse. Really bad. This is one of my least favorite pictures, but it survived 4 editions of my book because when I went to Guatemala in 1980, nobody really wanted to talk to me. The Army thought they equated me with Jimmy Carter. They called him Jimmy Castro, who was on his way out. So, oh, you're part of Jimmy Castro's government. The guerrillas thought I was a CIA collaborator. And then the wealthy didn't want to talk to me because, whatever. And so actually photographing the wealthy was harder than going out with these Marxist guerrillas. And so I have very few pictures of wealthy people, except this was a debutante ball in 1981. It was very funny. Because of the violence, this Guatemala club had not held a debutante ball in 5 years. And the dads were getting kind of nervous because their sweet, thin little 16-year-old daughters were turning into sort of Zoftig 20-year-olds. And so it was like, let's shove these gals out the door. So they held this collective debutante ball for 5 years of debutantes, some of whom weren't that young anymore. This is getting into sort of this sort of arena of political violence. Guatemala was a contradiction because you have this huge number of people killed, but it was very hard to photograph it. You know, the army wasn't about to say, "Oh, come and see our massacre." And again, you had sort of I'd say three kinds of killings, political killings. Amnesty International in '81 called Guatemala a government program of political murder, and I can think of no better term for it. You had people who were abducted off the street. And you can see this in Ana Lucia Cuevas' film that Professor Contreras recommended, where these guys would just come up in unmarked Jeeps. In fact, maybe I have a picture. We'll get to it. And they would haul off people in the middle of the day. A guy would be coming out of a building with his briefcase, and they would just grab him and take him away. I mean, can you imagine just sort of going down the steps of one of your buildings here, and you would all be fair game for this if you had been students in Guatemala in 1980. Because even though you attend an academy, they say, well, these people are inquisitive and they're smart and they might form the future opposition. And you start talking to somebody and they hear you saying, well, gee, I don't know, I think maybe I'll join, my dad's a unionist, I think this is a good idea. Well, you're fair game. This was a mask for somebody who had been disappeared, and the priest did not want me showing his face. That's why his face is cut off in the photo. So these disappearances were one kind of violence. Another was these massacres where 200, 300, up to 400 people were slaughtered in 2 days. And this is a judicial. He's a plainclothes police agent who carries out orders to abduct people. And there he's just lounging in the middle of the day. I didn't walk up to him. And truth be told, the photo is slightly cropped. But there he is, just waiting for orders. Nobody's going to arrest him. And he's waiting to pile into a car or a Jeep without license plates and go haul off somebody and disappear them. This is somebody being hauled off by the police with their little Nazi helmets backwards, I think. This is not my photo. I took this photo of a newspaper. The house of the interior minister was ransacked in Guatemala City right after a 1982 coup, the March '82 coup. And they found the identity cards for all these Guatemalans who'd been targeted for disappearance. The interior minister fled the country. In fact, I think he's living in Florida. That's the current rumor. But they found these in his house. So can you imagine going into Joe Biden's house and finding your passport photo, your identity card there strewn somewhere in his den? That's the functional equivalent of this. And this, sorry that there's a little bit too much light, but this guy, he's a bodyguard. He's protecting a presidential candidate. In fact, the guy he's protecting, Mario Sandoval Alarcón, who died, he headed it was called the National Liberation Movement, and he defined it as the party of organized violence. And I interviewed him, and he had lung cancer, so he didn't speak. It was hard to hear him speak. He sort of talked like that. And so he said to me, in that kind of a voice, I was 26 years old. I sort of waltzed into his house, and he says to me, if I have to kill half of Guatemala so the other half can live in peace, I will do it. And because he'd sort of rasped this at me, I said to his aide, I said, did he just say what I think he said? And the aide said, well, you have to put it in context. And I was sitting there thinking, what context can there possibly be for this? This was in Neybach, the town that was the epicenter of this 2013 trial against former dictator Rios Montt. And I was working with a film crew. We were doing a documentary called Headline Today Guatemala. And we heard a bomb, it sounded like a bomb go off, and turned out it was a grenade. And the commander of the base at that time, the garrison at that time, Otto Perez Molina, is now Guatemala's president. He's a military guy, became president. And he was the commander then. And so they laid out these bodies and just let us photograph them. It's not clear what happened to them, to be honest. And this is part of what I was talking about, my fourth point about Guatemala. People have used this photo over and over again saying, the army killed these people, they killed them. Well, yes, the army did kill lots of people, but I'm not at all convinced they killed them, because the story was that these guys were 4 guerrillas, and they brought them in, and one of them had a grenade hidden in his boot, and they hadn't really searched them. And as a suicide act, took out the grenade, and it was and the 4 were killed. I sent pictures of their wounds to forensics at the International Commission of the Red Cross, the ICRC, and to other people I trusted, and nothing dispositive ever came out of it. They were just not sure how they died. This was a SWAT team right in front of my hotel, repelling a sort of popular protest. This was a coup in Guatemala, March 23rd, 1982. It was a military coup. Elections had been held 2 weeks before. Only 7% of the population bothered to vote, even though voting is an obligation in Guatemala. And so this guy, Aníbal Guevara, was voted into office. Then there was a coup, a young officers' coup it was called. The young officers were disgruntled with the way things were going. And so they installed this guy, Rios Montt, a brigadier, that's from where the coup, Brigadier General Rios Montt, flanked by Colonel Maldonado and Colonel Gordillo. And they gave a press conference. And the context for this was that violence had been rampant in 80, 81, open abductions, this surge in massacres that was getting going. And the young officers, they didn't want, I mean, they were certainly vehemently anti-communist, but they wanted to control the violence, and they wanted to sanitize it in some way. And Rios Montt had had a reputation for being an honest military officer and having been robbed of the 1974 elections. He actually won the 74 elections, and then there was a switcheroo at the local telephone company that was responsible for counting all the ballots, and he was denied the presidency. So the young officers saw him as someone who had been denied his place in history. They saw him as a reformist, which he was not. At this press conference, I mean, these are mostly my photos, he said, from now on, we're not going to murder. From now on, we're going to kill legally. And everybody's just standing, like, what did this person just say? And so he's off and running. And what actually happened under Rios Montt was, it was this bloodbath. There's sort of 3 periods of violence. One was from 78 to 81, which was marked by massive selective disappearances of unionists, of teachers, of students, of anybody the Army perceived as being potential opposition, whether they were or not. Then the second period of 82 to 83, when Rios Montt was head of state, was marked by these massacres. Especially, they were even as small as Guatemala is, the area of massacres was even smaller. Most of them were carried out in 4 departments. Departments are like provinces or regions. And that's where most of them were carried out. They weren't, the current folklore, especially in the wake of this, the criminal trial in 2013, is the Army wanted to eliminate Indians. They wanted to eliminate Mayans. I don't see it that way at all. In fact, I very much disagree with that perception. Indians, a lot of Mayan Indians were killed, but they were killed because they were in areas that where the Army thought, sometimes rightly, that there was a high level of support for the Marxist-Leninist guerrilla groups. There were 4 guerrilla groups: the Guerrilla Army of the Poor, the Revolutionary People in Arms, the Armed Rebel Forces, and the Communist Party, the Communist Workers, the Guatemalan Workers' Party. And so where they would tend to concentrate were places where they perceived support for the guerrillas. And what you had as a result, the third period, just to get this, was from 1984 to 85, when the Army reverted to having massacred all these people in the countryside. I mean, most Guatemalans still live in the countryside. They reverted to selective disappearances back in the capital. But the first result of Rios Montt's tenure, this 18 months he was in office, March 82 to August 83, was that these villages were just abandoned. This film crew and I arrived in this village in southern Quiché, and it was deserted. And then in rural areas, we were in this place, La Perla, which was a plantation that was taken over by the Army. You just had these soldiers just occupying, 200, 300 soldiers occupying these little hamlets. And this was a very interesting, we were basically fogged in this hamlet for 3 days. We were flown in this little tiny thing, tiny plane, and we couldn't leave. And so there's like 300 soldiers, and this this lieutenant, and they had us in these, like, the nicest place of their barracks, and there was one book to read in this place, and it was called Torture by Edward Peters. And so I read all about torture for 3 days. Well, you know, the army during this period also occupied hundreds of towns. They went into these rural areas where most of Guatemala's population is divided into Mayan Indians and Ladinos, who are partly Spanish and descendants and partly Mayan Indians. And you know, the sort of dividing line between Ladinos and Mayans is increasingly blurred these days. But they went into these rural villages, and back then you have to remember this is really important actually, because this was a pre-digital age. When I took a picture, I actually had to take it with film. Probably most of you have never seen film, and so we had no digital cameras. We didn't have fax machines. In Guatemala, we got UPS, I think, in 1981 or 1982. And that was a big deal, because to get my film out in 1980 and 81, even 82, I had to take my canisters of film, put them in an X-ray bag, take them to the airport, and put them on a plane, and hope that the Time courier in Miami found it coming off the luggage rack in Miami and put it on another plane to New York. And so what I'm saying is these places were really remote back then. I couldn't just sort of, take a little picture of this guy and woo, it's in South Africa 2 seconds later as a JPEG file. And so because they were this remote, it was hard to get news out. To get to this town, you had to travel 8 hours in a car, and 5 of those hours were on a dirt road. And this is a guy explaining, he was actually the commander of that place where the soldiers were trooping through, and he was telling us how Amnesty International was a Soviet puppet, and how he could just never kill anybody. And so then the interesting thing, though, is when the officers went off, and we just were sort of hanging out with the soldiers, and the soldiers, having seen us talk to their officers, thought, okay, we can trust these people. They would tell you in great detail how they went into these villages and killed people on camera. This is well, this is you guys in Guatemala. This is actually the equivalent of Green Berets. They're called carbiles, and special training. It's very specialized, arduous training. And this is their top dog. What do you call it here? The best student. What is it? Whatever. Okay. And so this is their top student. He's getting a machete as his prize on graduation from the Carbile Academy. We also, going back to U.S. involvement in Guatemala, this is, if you look very closely, it says U.S. Army there. This was at a point when U.S. military and economic aid was suspended to Guatemala, because the reason the Army did not like Jimmy Carter was because he had enforced this sort of perfunctory compliance with human rights norms in 1977. The Guatemalans said, we're not going to comply. We're just going to, if you're going to condition aid, we'll go elsewhere for it. We'll go to Taiwan and Israel, and indeed they did. But we found this Green Beret teaching counterinsurgency in Guatemala in 1982, and it sounds strange, but he's actually completely unaware that he shouldn't be doing this. So we filmed him, and it was on the CBS Evening News, front page above the fold of the Washington Post. And so my point, I guess, in this is, although Salvador was a much bigger story in the 1980s, because we had huge amount of economic and military aid going there. We had U.S. advisors. You had these pivotal events in the news, like 4 American church women being raped and murdered in El Salvador, and then the murder of an archbishop, and then the murder of Jesuit priests. That kept most journalists in Salvador, and so eyes were really not on Guatemala for this stuff. This is a U.S. military attaché observing what was a civil patrol rally, which I'll get to. As you can see, most of the soldiers in Guatemala are Mayan recruits. The officer corps is all Ladino or non-Indian. This is a dead soldier at a wash basin area in a little hamlet. This is one of Guatemala's 4 guerrilla groups, the Communist Workers' Party. I mean, it was really crazy. It was far less dramatic than it looks. because I said I wanted to go out with them. Like, okay, so I waited on a street corner with my Time magazine and my little carnation. They pick me up, I go in a car, they blindfold you, they take you about half a mile away, and they put you in another car, they blindfold you again, and then they take you, like the wind is whistling through the pine trees, like, where am I? And so you go into a garage, and they take me out, they take off the blindfold, and there are all these guys standing there. I was 26 years old. I was so stupid in so many ways. And there's this huge Claymore mine on the table, but the first thing they say to me is, do you want a Coke? And I'm like, yeah, I guess I do want a Coke. And then they spent the next 2 hours sort of talking dogma to me. But they were very polite and nice, and then they dropped me off at my hotel again when it was all over. So, and this was, to try to achieve some equilibrium here, although Army atrocities far outweighed anything the guerrillas did, 2 human rights reports that were issued post-peace accord signings in 1996, one by the church, which was issued in '98, and the day after it was issued, Monsignor Herardi, who had shepherded this report to publication, was murdered in the garage of his rectory. And then the next year, the UN put out a report. They attributed 93% of all killings in Guatemala to the armed forces and their Confederates. But the guerrillas did carry out acts of terrorism, and they did kill people. And this was a building that was bombed by the guerrilla army of the poor just before Christmas in downtown Guatemala City. And here's this lightning, protest writing. As you can see, the Guatemalan guerrillas, unlike the Salvadoran guerrillas, were really well armed. I mean, one pivotal difference between Salvador and Guatemala is that in Salvador, by 1982-83, it's estimated that the FMLN guerrillas controlled 1/4 of national territory. You had an extremely well-armed insurgency fighting an extremely well-armed and well-trained Salvadorian army. In Guatemala, its population of 6-7 million, you had 25,000 soldiers and maybe 5,000 armed guerrillas. And this is how half of them were armed. This was the EGP outside Quetzaltenango. This is a young urban guerrilla getting ready to do a lightning takeover of a high school in his bedroom with his little panda bear. This was actually a blue chip guerrilla organization. This was the Revolutionary Organization of the People in Arms, ORPA. And I spent a week on the side of a volcano with them. And this was Capitana Ana, who was actually a ranking officer in this insurgent group. And ironically, she was actually killed in Mexico many years later just by another ORPA member. They had a confrontation over money and where it went, and she was stabbed by one of her fellow ORPA guerrilla combatants. But it was actually a very interesting week because the journalist and I who went out with them, it takes about a day to go out with them. You travel at night, you're dropped off at a place. Actually, a Catholic priest helped me make this contact. And you walk at night because the army was all over this volcano. And it's a very narrow path, and I just remember I couldn't see anything. You couldn't have a flashlight because the army's around. And so they go, this guy says to me, oh, watch out right there because that's our pastry maker. And the pastry maker was their bomb maker, and he had little bombs by the side of the road. This is a man being brought in he's been captured by the civil patrol. The army forced men between the ages of 15 and 70 sometimes to patrol the area, not because they thought they'd find anything, but they wanted to control the civilian population by making them part of the civil patrol that had to report to the army. And as you can see, the army just sort of insinuated itself in every facet of daily life in Guatemala. And this is how they communicated back then, but it was very efficient. It was a really short leash from these remote areas to the national palace. If it was impossible that heads of state did not know what was going on in these rural areas. These are Ixil Mayans who are being captured and brought into, they're being corralled into the army, either into civil patrols or into these so-called model villages. This is a little girl who had been injured in an aerial bombardment by the army. And this model village, this entire town was razed, and the army reconstructed it so that the houses were in close proximity so they could control this population they didn't trust. I'm happy to say this, now this has been razed, and Coup is Coup again. There's a really nice bed and breakfast there, actually. These are these women who've been captured by the army, and they're being brought down for these, they're in this model village, Saval, and they're in the middle of an ideological talk by the army, why subversion is bad. And a lot of these women didn't even speak Spanish. This is burning an EGP flag. This is a huge first civil patrol rally in Nebach. I'm just going a little bit faster because I'm looking at the time here. Civil patrollers coming in. There's a wounded soldier being brought to our helicopter. The only really good advance in Guatemala in the 1980s was this. It was the founding of the Mutual Support Group for the families of the disappeared. I said that in 84, 85, there was another round of selective disappearances in Guatemala. And these women, in looking for their husbands in morgues and hospitals, founded this group to advocate for, to produce their husbands, their brothers, their sons. And this woman, Rosario Godoy, this woman, Blanca Rosal, I became very good friends with them. This was actually my hotel room. Rosario, this person here, was murdered by the army. She was in a shopping center during Holy Week with her 2-year-old son and her brother. The army abducted them, and their bodies were thrown in a ditch, a shallow ditch, the next day. The son, she had been raped, they were all tortured, and the son's fingernails were missing. And this is something even I didn't believe. And so I went to a nun who had been at the wake, and she said that his fingernails had been torn off, so it's assumed that they tortured the son, the 2-year-old, in front of the mother to try to get information. This is another GOM leader, Hector Gomez, who's a baker, and he was kidnapped during Holy Week. And Rosario was still alive. And Rosario and Ninette, another founder, and I, we went to Amatitlan, the town, for the wake. He'd been tortured with a blowtorch, and his tongue had been cut out. That's why the cotton's in his mouth. That's his widow at his funeral. This is a protest march protesting their deaths. I debated whether to include this. I was working with the 60 Minutes crew, and we were just sitting eating breakfast one day, and it said woman found with hands cut off. So we went to these 2 morgues outside the city, and this woman, Beatriz Barrios, had actually received asylum in Canada, and she'd been slated to go to Canada the next day. And the night before, she'd taken a taxi to a friend's house, and these judiciales, these armed plainclothes men, forced her out of the taxi and kidnapped her. And as you can see, it was just brutal. They cut off her hands. And so Guatemala, there's been some sort of sea change, I guess, in Guatemala. This is the first civilian president to take office in 30 years, Vinicio Cerezo. Here he is in his bathroom with his now ex-wife. And you can see he's got a pistol on, even for his inauguration. And he's surrounded, there were no real reforms under Cerezo. He was president from 86 to 90. Selective violence was way down, but the army still controlled stuff. And now what we have 20 years later is, Guatemala sort of is marching towards something a little bit better, but at the same time, there's this sort of tsunami of negative stuff. This is Nobel Prize winner Rigoberta Menchú during the proceedings that led to the trial of Rios Montt in 2013. The problem in Guatemala now is that there's still no real independence between the legislative, executive, and judiciary. The Constitution exists sort of in name only. Guatemala is the only country I can think of where a former president was arrested, indicted, and convicted in the United States and put in prison in the United States for 2 years for money laundering. And he's returned to Guatemala to a hero's welcome, and it's rumored he's going to try to run for president, and that Rigoberta Menchú, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, might be his running mate. I mean, this is where Guatemala, where reality makes fiction pale by comparison. And the current president of Guatemala, Otto Pérez Molina, is the guy on the right who was the garrison commander in Nebach when I was working there in the 80s. And the the two big problems in Guatemala, three right now, are one, extreme poverty, two, common crime. All my friends have been robbed at gunpoint, and of course, narco trafficking. And I think I'm about to be, we're ending here. And so this is just to end. This was the 2013 trial of Rios Montt in Guatemala. It was a huge media event. I think a mistrial would have been declared within 5 minutes in the United States. And so what we're, the questions today, how is Guatemala going to march forward? I really thank you for your time. Sorry I had to hurry it up here at the end.
Yeah, it's very difficult to cut off someone who's presenting such compelling work. You're very brave.
Thanks. Thank you.